Respected head and faculty members of Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Management, honorable resource persons, coordinators, and their participants. A very good morning to all of you. I, Sabah Sangeen, research scholar at the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Management, welcome you all to the second day of the 5-day workshop on research methodology on literary studies and humanities, which is being conducted by NIT Srinagar. Without any further ado, I request the convener of the workshop, Dr. Nasir Bhatt, to formally introduce the resource persons and begin today's session. Thank you.
Respected head, dear colleagues and members of organizing committee, dear scholars, friends, participants, and my dear, it's not working. Screen off. Okay, fine. And my dear friends, a very good morning to all of you. Welcome to the day 2 of the 5 days online national workshop on literary studies and humanities. On behalf of the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Management, National Institute of Technology, Srinagar, I, Dr. Nasir Farid Bhatt, convener of this workshop, extend my warm welcome to Professor Roshan Lal Sharma, who is going to illuminate us with his experienced talk. With his smooth delivery of words and to-the-point style of getting across, I hope we shall learn seminal skills in research in his lecture. Professor Roshan Lal is a senior professor in the Department of English and European Languages, Central University of Himachal Pradesh. He has formerly held many administrative positions, such as head of the Department of English and European Languages, Dean School of Humanities and Languages, Dean Students Welfare, Director of Research at Central University of Himachal Pradesh. He has a range of areas of specialization and interests, which include Indian literature in English, contemporary literary and cultural studies, new literatures of the world, literatures in translation, translation studies, narratology, and many more. Professor Sharma was awarded Fulbright Senior Research Postdoctoral Fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was also awarded Honorary Fellowship of the Institute of Research in the Humanities, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and many other awards and fellowships in India as well. Professor Sharma has published 15 books, more than 60 research papers and book chapters in international and national publishers of global repute. Professor Sharma has delivered invited lectures at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of California, Riverside, Chicago Public Library, and was invited he has visited many universities abroad, such as Yale University, McGill University, and Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, for research purposes. Professor Sharma is member of editorial board of various international journals, such as Review of International American Studies, World Journal of Gender and Literature, and he is also associate editor, Journal of English Literature and Language. He is also executive committee member, International American Studies, and joint secretary of Melis Mello, India. And today we have also joined by our respected head, Department of English, Professor Abdul Liman. It is our honor that he has always been with us in all the sessions, right from the day one, yesterday. Now, without any further ado, I request Professor Roshan Lal Sharma to begin his talk. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nasir. Thank you.
Welcome, sir.
Good morning, everyone. The head of the department, faculty of the School of Humanities and Management, NIT Srinagar, and dear research scholars. Well, it's always an opportunity to learn, actually. whenever we get such opportunities, to interact with youngsters. Thanks to Nasir, especially, who just opened up this opportunity, and who actually right from the very first day, I mean, he has been in touch, and I was myself excited about it. And the topic that he has assigned to me is applying critical approaches to research in literary studies. So, without any prefatory kind of remarks or anything, just because you are research scholars, I simply assume that you are aware of various, critical approaches. But I would just like to, offer a very kind of uh, you know, practically implementable, and practically sort of achievable, or practically, I would say, uh, doable stuff, about various modes of looking at literature or appreciating a literature. Nasir, you just need to let me know in case my voice wavers, or
No, it is
if
perfectly
my
fine, sir. We're of
if my video goes out. So do let me know, right?
okay, okay. I will.
Because there's a little structure that is there before me on screen, so I may not be knowing as to as to how I look and how I sound. So
It's
I mean,
going well.
the whole idea is that we look at critical approaches in an approachable manner, a manner that is accessible, something that stays with us. And when we take that formal plunge into literature of any sort, these approaches and the specialized terminology, associated with these approaches, that terminology becomes available to us. By and large, what happens is that we certainly have that knowledge of various approaches, but when it comes to the terminology tends to just elude us. We may have to, put in a lot of effort, and upon striving a little harder, we get to know them. Whereas the starting point has got to be that we gain orientation with these critical approaches in a way that they become part and parcel of our existence as researchers. Uh, so how do I look at approach, as each one of you, would agree that it's basically a mode or a method of looking at literature, a kind of perspective to analyze or examine literature. And, so when we introduce the term, literature, while talking about critical approach, these two terms are also, if approach could be a method, then what should this critical, I mean, the term critical imply? We should be careful. So for a researcher in English studies, let me tell you, this aspect of, enjoy literature, or reading literature, or pursuing literature for delight and enjoyment goes. And if at all you have to delight in it, if you have to enjoy it at the same time, you've got to be, extraordinarily careful, about its nuances, about its, its subtler dimensions, about its, intricate aspects. So that way, if I envision a researcher today, particularly in the realm of, particularly in the realm of literary studies, I envision a researcher who is who is on tenterhooks through and through. So बहुत सिंपल सी बात है, रिसर्चर के लिए कोई आराम नहीं है, रिसर्चर के लिए कोई लैटिट्यूड नहीं है, कोई इस तरह का लीवे नहीं है, that you might possibly, get a breather, that you tend to crave for. So the path of a researcher is, you know, it's clearly kind of, it's clearly charted out, and that's full of challenges, of course. So, when we talk about a method which is critical in nature, that simply implies that, a, a, a you know a mature kind of discernment, a maturer perception, and an understanding, which is which is different, from that ordinary kind of, ordinary reading for enjoyment of literature, is what we imply when we use the term critical. Because I mean, until or unless our understanding, has a particular purpose, has a particular, objective in view, we are not critically engaged. Another level, when we think in critical terms, we also think in analytical terms. We also think in very objective terms. We also think in profound terms. Profound in the sense that we tend to, scratch the veneer. We are not at all on the surface. We need to, delve deep. So a researcher that way, looks at literature and life at large in a considerable different manner compared to an ordinary reader of literature. So an approach that to critical, okay, and a critical literary kind of, understanding or analysis of literature is what we mean, when we say that, okay, we adopt certain critical approaches to analyze literature, to understand it, and to build a perspective about it, So it's a mode, a method, it could be a perspective. And then, we are, in a sense, of course, talking about literary criticism because literature is the locus. So that's kind of, analysis of literature. So we study, we examine literature, we interpret, we evaluate works of literature. And then, of course, I mean, we do not just stay there. It has got to be further layered, because we also bring in a considerable element of literary theory now, which does what, It adds one philosophical dimension, okay, to the analysis and understanding of literature. How? Because it tends to add, it tends to sort of provide a broader, more comprehensive, philosophical kind of frame to look at literature. That's something which is important, because, theory remains always interested in, in unraveling the meaning of, not just unraveling the meaning of specific text, but in more general or generalized problems as to how texts yield meanings, how meaning-making activity takes place within texts, and that's where literary theoretical dimension comes in. But when it comes to literary criticism, we are actually concerned about meanings and layers of meanings in specific or in particular texts. So literary criticism then offers the readers newer or different ways to understand an author's work, for that matter. So uh, now, of course, when we talk about literary criticism, we always think in terms of applying, theory in praxis. That's how we go about it, and that is what actually, this topic basically is concerned about. What possibly could be the purpose of you know developing these critical approaches and applying them? What possibly could be the purpose, or resorting to, say, for that matter, literary criticism? The fundamental aim is to widen your perspective, to enable the reader perspectivize literature better, to widen the comprehension of a particular author's corpus of writings, through examining, through analysis, and of course delving deep into issues concerning its themes, motifs, and of course issues concerning textuality. So in addition to that, you tend to stay with the text, you tend to spend a lot of time with the text, and then you resort to, certainly, close reading of the text as well. And then as a responsible scholar of literary studies, what you end up doing is you're able to come up with a comprehensive perspective of yours, which is based on rigorous analysis, of course, and that is basically evidence of your understanding of the text, and that's further examined, evaluated by your teachers, your evaluators, your your peers, your researcher fellows, in maybe seminars, conferences, etc., etc. So when it comes to the praxis aspect of literary criticism, this praxis of literary criticism is a space which is inhabited by a huge body, or I would say it is inhabited by numerous readers, and they are the ones who are interested in exploring diverse meanings. This could be a semantic kind of understanding of the text, or various other aspects, maybe structural or psychological, etc., etc. Now, when we talk about these diverse perspectives, I just said structural, psychological, formal, historical, maybe biographical, etc., etc. These exactly are termed as critical approaches, or these are basically methods based on which you carry out the literary criticism that you want to actually. For example, there are some of the critical approaches, and traditionally popular too, and I'll just touch upon them briefly, so that you could you could just connect with them, and then we can proceed further. Because towards the end of it, I'd like to just demonstrate, the reading of a deconstructive reading of a poem, so that you could, develop an understanding. And I'm sure quite a few of you would already be kind of, familiar with that. But we will definitely delve into the, practical dimension of a literary criticism. For example, excuse me. When we talk about, say, historical biographical criticism, we always aim at examining literature through a perspective which tends to look at the socioculture, this historical circumstances that have been that have been or that could be held responsible, to have had a deep or formative or shaping influence on a literary work. So, or the author's own historical context matters a lot. And when you read literature through this approach, you know, uh, uh, the importance of a work of literature cannot be delinked, from the historical milieu, okay, prevalent within that particular context wherein the work of literature is located. That milieu is really important. What is believed by a critic here is that, until or unless you have got the knowledge of that historical context, you cannot do justice with the interpretation of a particular text. For example, if we have to view Shakespeare's history plays, you cannot in any way overlook, the entire historical background, that is attached with each one of Shakespeare's history play. And then you are really interested to decode and to understand as to which particular historical context has served as a source to a particular play by Shakespeare. You do read that, and you find towards the end that yes, that has got a bearing on it. And not only that, you also get to know as to what are the liberties that have been taken by a dramatist like Shakespeare, vis-a-vis a representation or a representation of history. You're concerned about that because there is that biographical element attached to it. So author's biography also remains, very important for you, and you do take that into account. And these serve as, tools, and these serve as kind of strategies to decode a text. Likewise, if you have to think in terms of, say, for that matter, sociological criticism, okay? Now, it has to focus on how a work of literature is related, to the society or to a socio-cultural context out of which it has come. Now, what's important here is that, the literary work ultimately is meant for the readers, and readers too belong to a particular society or socio-cultural context. So they understand until or unless they understand that socio-cultural context, it will be difficult for them, to get to the nuanced kind of understanding of that text. And that is what sociological critics actually believe. So, I mean, one of the forms, say for that matter, as an instance, in case you're interested, Marxist criticism, happens to be one of its types, even though the emphasis remains, on the economic dimension, majorly the capital, its production and circulation, etc., etc. So, what it does is, for example, Marxist criticism, it shows as to how, or it tends to work out as to how a work of literature, looks at this tussle between various classes, okay, in a societal system. That's precisely what it aims at exploring. Likewise, you have got say another school of criticism, another approach to study literature. For example, psychoanalytic criticism. Now, this critical approach basically aims to look at literature, you know, uh, based on maybe uh, issues concerning, various psychological phenomena, such as, say, desire possibly could determine, the personality of a character in a major way. And if, the mindset for that matter of a particular character is characterized by neuroses, or schizophrenia, it's going to have certain reasons, or it's going to have a certain importance, in the larger network of textuality in a text. That's what is important. So in a work of literature, various psychological aspects are more important, that happens in the minds of characters, that various psychology. And then the fundamental basis is, you know uh, Freudian psychology, basically. So psychoanalytic critics, they believe that an author's unconscious thoughts are tend to find expression, through the work, or through the articulation of various characters in a work of literature. And therefore, the character's behavior and character's thoughts in a particular text become really, really important. And then it's not just that. There could be images, symbols, metaphors, subserving various or varied, shades of the character's mind, in the course of the text. Another thing, for example, if there are Oedipal dynamics, we know where Oedipus complex comes from, or other family dynamics. These dynamics are also decoded, with the help of psychoanalytic approach. And then, it's not just the characters, psychological states that are important. At times, through characters, psychological representation, readers tend to determine at times, at times overdetermine, at times underdetermine, at times maybe exactly determine the state of mind, of the author who creates or who writes that work of literature. And then, if you remember, you must have read it in the history, history books, history of English literature. This particular, or in the history of literary criticism, practical criticism at one point in time, was very, very popular. And it simply enables, readers to look at literature as it is. And practical criticism does not allow you to move out of the text. You're supposed to stay within the text and then, look at it. And the same kind of thread, though considerations could be different, are there in formalism, where once again, the language of the text, is more important. Text is all. Once again, you do not rely on any kind of, sociocultural or psychological or possibly, historico-biographical elements in order to, you do not bring in such elements to understand or interpret the text. And you are rather, concerned about examining a work of art or a work of literature based on the uh, it's based on its artistic merit, its qualities as a work of art, So you are actually concerned about examining and analyzing its formal elements. So, like what kind of language and figures, what sort of figures of speech have been used, say, in a poem. So, and that technique is important, and the form is very important, and themes are important, which eventually have a bearing, on the overall form. So formalism tends to uh, use imagery to possibly maybe illustrate symbols, and there could be that organic unity, but then the reader actually is expected to work it, or interpret that work or literary work in such a way that its organic unity could be worked out, via looking into different parts, of that work of literature, and you read them in such a way that eventually it emerges, or you are able to establish linkages to view it very logically and rationally as a whole. So how various various uh, figurative dimensions of language come together in order to lend a unique character to a work of literature, and they are interconnected, of course, and figures of speech such as, you have got simile, metaphor, paradox, irony, ambiguity, at times even tension, in a work of literature. These are all looked in, okay, in a very, very detailed way, so that the collective whole possibly could be decoded, and so that you are able to develop a clear and a fair estimate of the artistic and aesthetic quality of that work. So that's yet another one. And then I move on to reader response criticism. As all of you understand, the reader remains the locus there, this basically, this approach to study literature is, it is built on the premise that the reader's interpretation of a text is extraordinarily important. This is this is the most important source to to analyze a text or a work of literature critically. Reader, okay, uh, becomes important, and a reader's kind of engagement with the text becomes important, and through that engagement, the creation of meaning also assumes relevance, because ultimately you have to decode meaning of the text. So, reader response critic would always resort to very close analysis of the text, and this close analysis. What does it aim at, basically? What it aims at is that the text ultimately has to open itself up. This close analysis, wherein each and every word and every single phrase is important. Okay, you uh, you always view a phrase or possibly a word, uh, you first of all lend it importance. That's first thing. Okay, uh, one particular phrase at times end up, providing you that key to, to unravel the entire text. That ends up at times enriching your whole reading experience. Uh, uh, Another thing, for example, when a reader reads a poem, I mean, is it just the word, the printed word on the page that is important? Or does, say for that matter, while understanding the nuances of a poem, reading that important component of sound is also important? That's a serious question. And does that engagement with the sounds, of different words used very rhythmically at times and very musically at times, does that the kind of resonance that such words have, does that sound has does that sound have a, a, a substantial kind of bearing on the semantic universe of that poem or not? So sound becomes all the more important, something that we term as dhwani. So another thing, which is important for a reader response critic is, uh, readers, own situatedness, readers' subject position. This situatedness and subject position, these two terms are really important from the viewpoint of researchers. Whichever part of the world you are located in is important. Who you are, where you come from, how you look at the world, what you think about life, how do you perceive the world, your identity, okay? Your agency, your subjectivity, all these play a very, very important part, when you act as a reader to decode a poem or to understand a story or to explain, possibly say, a story, a narrative, a fictional narrative. So that's how a reader response critic would, for that matter, go about a literary work. So another approach, that we tend to make use of, is say for that matter, let me jump, and post-structuralism. Now, when a post-structuralist does literary criticism, what exactly does he look at? Something very different happens here, and I'm sure you must be aware of, theories such as structuralism, and we have already talked about formalism, and how eventually we experience that linguistic or language shift with Ferdinand de Saussure coming on the scene, and thereafter, of course, the entire structuralist endeavor becoming such a closed and claustrophobic kind of compartment that post-structuralists like Derrida and Foucault and Roland Barthes, of course, included, they found it hard to cope with that kind of closed sort of structuralist way of looking at literature. And all of you must have in mind, I'm sure you must have gone through that seminal essay by Derrida, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, okay, which he presented in Johns Hopkins, at one point in time around 1966. And then, of course, that marks the shift into post-structuralist thinking, of course. And this is marked by just abandoning ideas of formal and structural cohesion, that kind of unity that structuralists and formalists would always envision, that organic, holistic kind of, dimension attached to art was something that was left behind, because what they do is they tend to question, any assumed sense of universal truth, and that kind of universal truth eventually becomes a crutch of a sort, a point of reference, and you keep referring back to it time and again, and you find it so reliable, that every single thing has to exist in relation to that. The entire post-structuralist endeavor seems, to get somehow liberated from that, and what Derrida very carefully deals with the term, which is pretty radical, in its very inception, called play. So, alongside Derrida, another post-structuralist, critic called Roland Barthes is the one who at one point in time was structuralist himself. But having practiced that, he actually becomes aware of its limitations, and he also has to make an altogether different announcement, through the writing of this essay called the death of the author. And the ending of that essay, you must all be aware of that. You must have read that. Is that this death is really, it has a tremendous metaphorical significance, because then it's eventually the reader who takes charge. So why I talked about post-structuralism is because I actually want to move on to deconstruction, a method, of course, evolved by Jacques Derrida. And this method, with the help of this method, a deconstructionist critic, he tends to, just pick up texts, ideas and arguments that are there in the form of language within the text, and ascertains in a certain way, in a careful way, as to how these ideas and these arguments are full of contradictions, and how, these ideas and how these contradictions, that are inherently there, alongside ideas and arguments, there are contradictions. So these contradictions, they render any particular kind of reading or singular kind of reading of a text impossible. Thereby, of course, a deconstructionist reading would open up the scope of interpretation, of a text. Deconstruction could be done in several ways. Towards the end of my presentation, I think I don't have much time left, and I better now, Nasir, I think I have 7-8 minutes more. Am I right, Dr. Nasir? Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, sir. I was attending another professor's call.
No, that's perfectly fine. Nasir, do
Yes,
I
sir.
have 5-10 minutes more?
Yeah, sure, sir.
Okay, because now I would like to, move on to the the applicational dimension of these critical approaches. So thank you.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you, sir.
So we are there, and alongside deconstruction, I'd like to briefly touch upon the feminist approach to criticism very briefly, and then of course I'll just take up one of Robert Frost's poems, and then I'll just try and deconstruct the text, okay, in a very brief way, so that you could just understand as to how a deconstructionist critic would operate. So when it comes to feminist criticism, all of us know that this as a movement, it gained momentum in the mid 20th century, and literary critics at that point in time, they started looking up to gender studies for new modes of literary interpretation. So one of the most important and earliest proponents of feminist criticism has been Virginia Woolf, and she's written this essay, and I'm sure all of you must have gone through that, A Room of One's Own. So and there are several other notable feminist critics, but what all do they do that's important for us? A feminist critic is always concerned about how men and women, male and female characters in a particular work of literature are portrayed. How are they represented? And in the process of representation, there is a whole network of power relationships involved. So men would always emerge as more powerful compared to women, during portrayal, or during the portrayal of these characters. So you read a narrative carefully, you come across male-female characters, and you would say as to how power relationships between men and women are worked out. Another aspect which a feminist critic would always a feminist critic would always care for, would be the how are these male female roles defined, and how does these notions of masculinity and femininity are delineated. Say, for that matter, the hierarchical kind of representation of male and female characters, basically. But a particular work of literature also tells us about economical, political, social, and psychological dimensions of, say, for that matter, patriarchal mindset, which rules the world, which tends to rule the world. So that mindset needs to be not only decoded, challenged, exposed, but undermined in a way that there could be some sense of justice, or we seem to be operating in the direction of dealing with that discourse of justice and equality. That's how this feminist approach to study literature would operate. And there are several other ways of looking at literature as well. I confined my focus on most of the traditional approaches, but I think I'll just devote 3 to 4 or possibly 5 minutes to a latest phenomenon, particularly in the field of, I would say, literary studies, and that is technocriticism. And also throwing a little light on how, the contours of this conventional literary narrative or literary text has undergone a drastic shift and drastic change. That's important. Now, because we are in an environment where, rapid media changes are taking place, and it's a new media multiplicity, a context in which we are. We locate ourselves. And when it comes to that conventional perception of the printed word, I mean, that seems to be important, undoubtedly still existent, but there are several other alternative ways of looking at literature. And this literary narrative, all of us would agree, I think, it has been pushed, or it seems so, that it's pushed to the edge in this post death of the author, or post death of the author kind of scenario, wherein this notion of author, text, reader, various notions, these notions stand multifariously appropriated because of hypertext, electronic textuality, and electronic fictions, along with their multiplex modes of production. So, we also need to very carefully, because it is really intricate, to work out this layered relationship between literary text and this very, very newly arisen cultural phenomenon called e-literature, that comprises, of course, electronic literature, digital literature, and new media writings. So, when we talk about technocriticism, then this basically emerged, or it came into being as a response to digital age marked by drastic and very rapid technological changes, particularly this new media ecology, which had very serious and grave kind of bearing on the printed word or literature, to the extent that some would perceive it as a threat, to conventional narrative. But of course, there are others, there are people, there are critics who observe that literature has already moved beyond the precipice, beyond that edge, expanding its scope of representation, and alongside, of course, a range of techniques in new media kind of assemblage, we could call it, without compromising its vital spirit, essential spirit. So, technocriticism basically, it has developed as a mode, of interpreting new versions or new forms of literary texts as e-literature, e-texts, hypertexts, blogs, and diverse media writings, alongside this electronic and digital literature. So, we are basically in a scenario today where at one level, of course, we have our critical approaches in mind, but those approaches that have been used more conventionally, we have moved ahead. These approaches are also availed of, but we have got then diverse range of theories that have come up, But those theories are also, informed by the modes and methods that we have been adopting, that we have been, employing based on our conventional understanding of, say, for that matter, critical approaches. Or when we do literary criticism, very carefully and very committedly analyzing texts, but its philosophical dimension, which is its theoretical dimension, also seems to have occupied the space of literary interpretations in a big way. So now, because it's already 11:34, I'll just pick up, a poem by Robert Frost, and the title is, Mending Wall. And if you want to just have a look at, the deconstruction, a very methodical deconstruction, of this poem, it is there in Louis Tyson's book, Critical Theory Today. But I'll just read it, and then maybe for 2 to 3 minutes, I'll just take up three key issues from the poem, and then just let you know as to how a deconstructionist critic, would look at a poem like Mending Wall. All of you must have gone through that poem. But just because I'm going to do it right away, I'll just read it out slowly. So just try and lend a serious ear to the poem, so that we could become part of the critical discussion later. Mending Wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I've come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone. But they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps I'm in, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are leaves and some so nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. One on a side, it comes to little more. There, where it is, we do not need the wall. He's all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here, there are no cows. Before I build a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moved in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors. Now, if you focus hard on this poem, you will get to know as to what the tension is. And that tension actually is the very premise. That contradiction, in the ideas that are being put forth, that conflicting kind of development of thought or ideas, that paradox of existence, expressions, that are more of oxymorons, those contradictions, those contrarieties actually are the premise on which deconstructionist criticism, it builds its citadel. And that citadel is in no way permanent. And if at all I have to envision, this citadel, I'd like to, envision it like that sunny dome of pleasure, cold riches, which eventually has to melt. So I have to be careful there. Now, in this poem, wall is the central metaphor. It has to come up every season. It has to be mended every season. You've got a parallel, flow of, ideas. One particular thinking, is pro-convention, and another disrupts that. The conventional belief is that good fences make good neighbors. The disruptive dimension is, why not cows? Why only fences? When you envision the metaphor of wall, Frost has done that so beautifully. And let me tell you one thing, you cannot come across a better deconstructive or deconstructionist poet than Robert Frost. This is what, I have been able to gather out of my readings of Frost, of course, This wall is there, which is there as a central metaphor. But as it comes up, it has to wall something in and wall something out. A clear-cut kind of division, a clear-cut, sort of contradiction, a clear-cut of binarism. One is this way, another is that way. Something, this inside and outside. This binarism becomes possible only and only when you have erected this wall, And not only that, it goes further. And this binary opposition, which tends to kind of, which tends to serve as the fundamental structural frame of this poem, this disagreement, between the speaker and the neighbor, this runs parallel. This notion of conforming to the tradition and challenging the tradition and disruption of that tradition, that possibility of disruption of that tradition, this goes on and on, through and through. Undoubtedly, towards the end, it appears as if the conventionalist notion has been allowed to prevail on that non-conventional, or unconventional notion. But that's actually not the truth. Because it's interesting, the wall needs to be mended every spring season. Why? Even the nature conspires against wall. It is erected and something happens from within the nature and it has to, come apart again. When the wall menders move around, they find those cracks and this is not heard. So, Frost has this uncanny capacity, to attribute, such interesting causes that he would make happen extremely intrinsically. And if you remember, the structure, sign, and play by Derrida, what he says is that language bears within itself the necessity of its own critique. The wall bears within itself the necessity of its own undoing. I mean, if you look at it from that perspective, I think a whole new interpretation possibly could be reached. So that's just just a tip of an iceberg, but then the whole idea could be developed further. But you could have a careful look, on Louis. Look at this Louis Tyson's book, and you will get to know as to what I imply. That's how you could apply deconstruction, or deconstructionist this critical kind of mode in order to interpret possibly a poem. Now I won't take much time because it's already 11:44. I could have at the max gone not beyond 11:35. I've already exceeded time. And if you have questions, observations, and comments, do come forward. You can ask questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It was very wonderful session, sir, for us, sir. Can I ask, sir, something, sir?
Yeah, sure, Dr. Nasir.
Oh, yes, sir. I'm Khan. I am a research scholar from Vivekananda Global University, Jaipur.
Muhammad Ibrahim, could you please open your camera and show your face to us? That would be more convenient for us to answer the question. Okay, thank you. Sir.
Yeah, Ibrahim, go ahead.
Please.
Ibrahim, you are not clearly audible.
Ibrahim, your voice is not, you are not audible to me.
Clearly audible, sir. 1 minute, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are now. Please go ahead.
Sir, my research area is John Donne's contentious conceit is a deconstructive analysis, sir.
Okay.
Your side, how can I do deconstruction of John Donne's contentious conceits, metaphysical conceits? To know and contradictions in
Okay, right. I got your question, Ibrahim. Ibrahim, thank you. What you said was, if you have to study John Donne's conceits, how can you act as deconstructionist critic, right?
Yes, sir. That's my actually research.
See, when it comes to deconstruction, Ibrahim, you must remember one thing. A poem by any poet actually is language. It is in Derridian terms, orthographic representation of what the poet wants to say. Look at it this way. When I say that language bears within itself the necessity of its own critique, sometimes deconstruction as a method of reading literature appears to be terribly constricting as well as constrictive, confining as well as confined, limiting as well as limited method also. But that needs to be accepted, right? So, you just have to look at language first, and if you read it carefully, what do you come across? You come across the possibility of contradiction in thought. Every single poet would try and give the impression that whatever she or he is coming out with is very cohesive, very organized, and beautifully, nicely, immaculately structured. Okay? Because until or unless a poet believes so, she or he cannot leave it like that. But we know, another fundamental principle of a poem, that it can never be viewed in terms of formal closure, ever. A poem always remains in that suggestive domain. It always remains open-ended. But every single conceit, the fundamental premise for a conceit is what? There is this contradiction between, reality and that Imagination, reality and imagination, fundamental contradiction. Ibrahim, do I make sense? The
Yes, yes, sir.
reality is too far fetched compared to the figure of speech which is being used to represent that extremely obliquely and indirectly.
Yes,
That
sir.
can serve as the fundamental ground for deconstruction. That here is language, which basically refuses to come to terms with in a rather homogeneous manner. I mean, heterogeneity being the norm of a conceit, this poetic idiom itself is deconstructionist. Why? Because it tends to show you the limits of language as it is used in ordinary parlance. Deconstructionist, as a deconstructionist critic and deconstructionist scholar, you can act as a deconstructionist yourself. You can look at the poet also as a deconstructionist. Okay, you have to make a choice, right?
Sir, we have another question.
Sir, one more thing, sir. Can you hear your, sir?
Ibrahim, yeah, okay,
Okay.
tell me. Sure, Ibrahim. हम फिर दूसरा क्वेश्चन लेते हैं. बोलिए
Yes, sir.
इब्राहिम.
Contact number, sir. I need your contact number, sir.
हाँ, आपको नासिर जी दे देंगे. You are
You
welcome.
can contact me
आप
for
हमारा email
that.
भी ले लेना. ठीक
Okay,
है?
so we are going to have another question from AK Parihar. He has raised his hand, and after that, Bilal will be asking his question, and we have another third question from Sarthak Verma. I will be narrating the question myself later on. But first, Mr. AK Parihar, could you please express or tell us what your question is?
Parihar, please go ahead. Parihar, yes.
Thank you, sir. Sir, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Sir, my question is regarding to theory and its practice in scholarly writing. And it is like this, that suppose if I want to demonstrate religious vibes in Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Anand Math, should I take theory as an absolute form of practice to analyze the literary text? And is it unfair if I just avoid the literary framework as an approach to demonstrate the social realities within the text?
It's a very, very good question, Parihar. I appreciate it. Your question, the fundamental nature of your question is, to also think simultaneously about the limitations of literary theory. एक चीज जो मैं आपको बताना भूल गया, एक चीज बता दूं, मैं उसको क्लियर कर देता हूं. Every single critical approach to study literature has its limitations. Every single literary theory, okay, is based on certain assumptions and is not, absolutely complete in itself. Each and every literary theory and each and every critical approach has its limitations, right? So that sometimes, we do not just follow one single theory, we go very eclectically and we go for a blend, of various approaches to study literature. परिहार जी, आप जो कह रहे हो बंकिम चंद्र चैटर्जी में अगर आपने religious vibes पढ़नी है, is literary theory a must? That is your question, if I took it right. देखिए, एक बात मैं आपको बता दूं, लिटरेरी थियरीज को एज स्कॉलर्स आपको बहुत शिद्दत से पढ़ना चाहिए, सबको बहुत अच्छे से समझना चाहिए. पर अच्छे से समझने का मतलब नहीं है हमने लिटरेरी थियरी पढ़ी और बेड़ियां अपने हाथों में और अपने दिमाग में डाल दी. नहीं, ऐसा बिल्कुल भी नहीं. You go through them, you understand them. If you do not want to resort to any theoretical, say for that matter, lens offered by theorists or critics, from the Western world, if you think that that particular frame is absolutely inadequate to my kind of, pursuit of research, what you need to do is you need to completely do away with that, but evolve your own method of research. परिहार जी, मुझे
Yes,
तो आपके थीसिस में ये देखना है कि आपका रिसर्च मेथड क्या है, और मैं ये नहीं चाहूंगा कि आप डेरिडा को अंदर घसीट करके लाओ, नहीं नहीं नहीं, आपको, आई मीन, nevertheless you have to build a method of research, but interestingly any kind of method that you resort to will fall under one of the rubrics, that I talked about. मान लीजिएगा आप किसी भी थियरिस्ट को अंदर नहीं लाते हैं, आपका मेथड कहीं ना कहीं मैच करेगा जरूर, आप देखेंगे कैसे भला। जब आप बंकिम चंद्र चैटर्जी के टेक्स्ट स्टडी करोगे, when you are going to resort to the in-depth analysis, of text by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, you would be resorting to possibly say close reading of those texts, and you possibly might, come up with your own kind of, perspective, and you would like that perspective is revered, respected, accepted, and of course rewarded towards the end. Then let me tell you one thing, that without naming theorists who have been the propounders of reader response theory, you are resorting to the same method. You got my point?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sir. We are having here so many questions. Let us briefly address a couple of other people as well.
Sure.
We have
नासिर जी, परिहार जी, अगर आपका कोई और डाउट हो तो आप मुझे लिख सकते हो, ठीक है?
Okay, I will share your email ID to all the people, sir.
नासिर जी बोलिए, next question.
Okay, so we have questions from YouTube as well.
Sure.
The things are going on air. What is methodology applied in a doctoral research of ethnicity, ethnography in the post-colonial novels of Salman Rushdie? So there can be a one-liner or two-liner answer to this question, sir.
Very simple. I mean, ethnic studies is apne aap mein, it's a complete branch. All right. So the broader rubric is post-colonial studies. If you are sharp enough under the post-colonial studies, you go in for ethnic studies or ethnic dimension of post-colonial studies, and you will find your answers.
Yes, sir. And I think we have another professor in the second session who is expert in sociology. And any questions? Yes, any questions in the field of sociology can be asked to Dr. Iqbal. He will be better addressing these questions.
Sure.
And we have another question here, sir. For the could you please also throw some light on the concept of post theory? Can we envision a time where all the critical approaches are put to rest and the pure pleasure value of literature is celebrated instead? Quite a philosophical question, sir.
No, you see, the point is that ultimately, what was Walter Pater's concern? What was I mean, the entire aestheticism movement focused that. And what about, I mean, this has been there, ever since the time of Aristotle. Say, for that matter, they've always talked about the sheer pleasure value of literature. That's one thing. And when we talk about post theory, it's like, somehow this is nothing but an effort to free ourselves, from that, theoretical jargon, basically. And what happens, because this has been a very, very, very genuine concern also. In the process of pursuing or hardcore pursuit of literary theory, literature has been relegated terribly to an inferior position. Post-theory came into being, as a reaction to that kind of, phenomenon. But, people have started saying now to our friend, I'd like to suggest that it's not just post-theory, the environment we are in. We have moved even beyond that. It's post theory. So my suggestion would be to my friend that we are scholars of literary studies, and our first and foremost passion should be literature, followed by theory, followed by modes or methods of studying. First of all, grounding in literature is required.
Very well said,
Dr.
sir. So, due to the paucity of time, so we have another section shortly
Sure,
coming up.
please.
So, I must declare the formal end of this session, and therefore I express my special thanks and indebtedness to you, sir, for being so benevolent to us, to have spared your precious time with us, sir. And I am really thankful for your wonderful talk. It was very interactive and illuminating to all of us. The questions from the scholars and participants, uh, the questioning tells us that this was not a simple kind of lecture. It was quite interactive and informative. I'm also thankful to the participants who have shown such interest and enthusiasm in this session. I hope the participants have had a good learning experience in this lecture. I
Thank you.
now thank
I
you,
also
sir.
enjoyed it. Thank you, Nasir ji, and thank you all the
Sir.
participants.
It was
I
very
take your leave.
it was a wonderful session, sir. I now must announce a short break before we start another brilliant lecture by Dr. Bhatt Iqbal Majid. He's an expert in sociology. His PhD from anyway, I'm going to introduce him formally in the next session. Thank you. See you again. Stay tuned, and we shall be coming back to you within a couple of minutes, 4 or 5 minutes. Thank you again. Thank you. Participants and especially to Dr. Bhatt Iqbal Majid. We are blessed to have Dr. Iqbal with us for this session. Dr. Iqbal is an assistant professor at the Department of Social Work, Central University of Jammu, with his MPhil and PhD degrees from the School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His major research area is tribal studies, nomadism, social policy, and political economy of health. He is recipient of various prestigious scholarships and fellowships, which include uh, full fellowship for attending summer school on global minority rights, organized by National University of Public Service, Budapest, Tom Lantos Institute, Budapest, Middlesex University, London, at Budapest, Hungary. He got fellowship for attending the Arogyam workshop at University of Edinburgh, organized by India Edinburgh Institute, and he also got fellowship from Indian Council of Medical Research. I now request the learned academic Dr. Bhatt Iqbal Majid to commence his lecture. Welcome, sir, and over to you.
Okay. Am I audible, Dr. Nasir?
Yes, you are audible. It would
Okay,
be
thank you. Just give me a minute. I will just share the presentation.
that will be wonderful, sir.
Okay, is my presentation visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, all right. Okay. So let me at the very outset thank the Department of Humanities and Social Science, National Institute of Technology, Srinagar, and particularly to the organizers of this FDP for inviting me to speak to all of you about my own research and also how I have kind of used this concept of grounded theory. So beginning with it, I will just kind of lay out my talk on the idea of research in social sciences. That how research in social sciences is itself a very interesting domain. So as we know that in social sciences, the debate of objective and subjective elements in the research always interplay in our discourses. They play a part in our own engagements. So this debate of how far social sciences has to be objective and what are the subjective elements that come into play in the social sciences has been continuing over many decades. And this debate has shaped the research globally. Now, having said this, we know that this debate is always seen in comparison to the element of objectivity in the scientific research. That it's always seen that scientific research is something which is very objective, where generalizations are quite often spread. And in comparison to that, social science has always been questioned for the very scientific objectivity of the very system of social sciences, the knowledge creation in social sciences. Now, we must know that in social sciences, there is, of course, always a certain defined methodology, which you would have seen always, that we have certain kind of given methods, given methodology, certain tools which we use in our research process. But irrespective of those given methods and a defined methodology, which much comprehends like the scientific methodology, the role of researcher and the respondents or the participants becomes very crucial in social sciences. Now, in order to make it a little more clear, we must understand that how social sciences explore or research in a certain given context is also dependent on who the social scientist is. What are his or her or their own identities involved in the process. Now, this kind of what we say as the influence of researcher in the process of research raises many questions on the validity or on the very objectivity of the whole research. And it's in this process that there has been push within the social sciences research for developing a scientific objectivity. And that's where you see that empirical studies coming up in the social science research. We have now studies in sociology, studies in clinical psychology, and studies in many other disciplines of social sciences coming up, which are trying to develop that scientific objectivity within them. We see large sample studies, for example, studies on drugs, studies on mental disorders. All of these are now the studies which are trying to push for certain kind of that objectivity. But this, in a way, is all a certain push that we have to stay very objective. We have to develop an empiricism. So therefore, this heavy emphasis of verification and generalization of the results in social sciences pushed many of the social scientists to look for alternatives. And that is where we see the alternative being seen in terms of that question is about rigor in the research. Because there was this also question which was, pushed for social sciences, that wherever qualitative research is being used, and which is mostly used in social sciences, it lacks that rigor. So therefore, quantitative use of quantitative research methodology was again emphasized upon in the social sciences. However, this push and these kind of struggles, these kind of debates also led to what we see as the emergence of new areas of research in social sciences. And this is where we see in current times the field work-based studies in social sciences have taken the shape. Now that's why we have disciplines like sociology, anthropology particularly, and we have like social work, we have even demography, demographic studies, and globally we see such disciplines taking a pace in most of the universities. For example, if you see in the West, anthropology as a discipline is coming up very heavily because it has much to do what we say on the basis of field-based studies. And now in the current times, this field-based studies have been accepted as a domain of knowledge creation, which are very valid and which have kind of negated away those questions which have been raised for their authenticity, for their objectivity. And that is where we see the grounded theory comes into being. Grounded theory was basically, if you see its emergence, if you see its origin, it was basically an attempt to question, to answer, or to kind of give a rebuttal to all those kind of accusations, to give a rebuttal to all those queries that have been raised over a period of time about the scientific objectivity, about the empiricism in the qualitative research. So the push which was once from towards the quantitative studies in the social sciences was kind of resisted by the emergence of the coming of the grounded theory. This in a way, again, this coming of grounded theory into being again generated that rigor and enthusiasm in the social sciences domain about having the field-based studies, and that's where the grounded theory played a major role. Okay, this was kind of an overview how grounded theory, you will see, came into being. So there is a larger historical perspective about the emergence of the grounded theory, but I'm not just going into much of that detail. This was a kind of overview about that. Now, when we say grounded theory, there are many questions, because this word that's attached to it is theory, that creates a lot of what we say is a buzz also, and a kind of confusion among most of the researchers or the students or the scholars involved in the research process, or involved in the studying of the social sciences. So this word of theory is very often sound something that there is a broader framework, there is a theory that's already out there, and we have to kind of base our research on the lines of that theory. But that's not the case. Grounded theory is again seen both as a methodology and a method. Now, this idea that grounded theory, what is it all about? So these two words, grounded and theory, what do they constitute? Now, it's being kind of seen that grounded theory is basically a theory that is developed. It's not something, a theory that's already there. Grounded theories, that's why we say it's a methodology and it's a method, which is being developed based on the data that's being generated in the field. So data that's being generated in the field, the data that's being collected in the field is something that generates a theory, and that's why it's called as grounded theory. Now we can also say in layman terms that it is something which is based on the very inquiry that we engage at a very grassroots level. We engage at a very ground level. Now, this theory, if we see about this grounded theory, this is usually used. What is it about? That will I come in the later part. Then this is used in all those domains of social sciences where there is either a very meager research, or the research which is not so apparent, or the research that's not being done adequately. It's where there is very little research being done. So this is where the grounded theory is mostly applied and has been mostly used. So grounded theory, some of the very unknown, unexplored areas in the social sciences, particularly in the field of health studies or in the field of clinical psychology. There have been various phenomena or various issues or various areas where the research is yet to be kind of very substantive. And in those areas is where the grounded theory has found its appeal, and where the grounded theory has been extensively used. Now, this theory was developed in 1965, or what you can roughly say as late 1965, by well-known sociologists Glaser and Strauss. Now, these two sociologists basically were working on the terminally ill patients. Now, this theory, they actually at that time when they were researching on these terminally ill patients, they actually were trying to know the means to be the terminally ill. Now, what sort of this illness, which is being terminal illness, that is terminal illness, as we know, is something where we are in a kind of a deathbed, in the process of dying. So these two sociologists were actually working, trying to understand this whole phenomena of being a terminally ill, being in the process of dying. So they tried to understand what it means, kind of what were the patients who were terminally ill going through. How do they visualize? How do they find the meaning on being on a deathbed? So at that point of the time, both these sociologists, they find all the means, or they find all those methodologies that were quite in way used at that point of the time. Those methodologies or those methods were not adequate enough to capture what these two sociologists basically were trying to capture. And that is where they kind of developed their own method, developed their own approach to study on these terminally ill patients. And that's where from the emergence, and that's where from the beginning of grounded theory came into being. So this is kind of the history of grounded theory. Now, both of these scholars, both of these sociologists, Glaser and Strauss, they actually challenged those traditional methods of we have to test or refute any theory in our research process. They completely challenged this. They find, no, this is not the kind of adequate strategy, or this is not adequate process which we are going to use in our study. So therefore they developed what is called as a grounded theory. Now, in grounded theory, they actually were also aware at that point of the time about the questions which I said, that there was this question that qualitative research is something which is not valid. It's kind of it has element of bias. So this quantitative idea of studies, that where you have to quantify, where you have to measure, is something which is only valid, and which is something which is unbiased to know about the truths. So both these sociologists were aware about those kind of questions which were very prevalent. However, keeping that still in mind, they thought that in order to answer these questions, we need to develop a different kind of methodology. But that methodology should also address the questions of validity, should also address the questions of this biasness which is being labeled on the qualitative research. And therefore they completely designed a newer form of methodology which they call as grounded theory. Now before going into the steps of how they did it, now grounded theory is basically, if you see in our usual methodologies of our research, what we do is we kind of have a certain idea that what is our research area. We develop a hypothesis, then we have a sampling, then we use a theoretical framework, then we collect the data, and then we kind of analyze or interpret this data on the basis of that framework and bring out our own results. That is how you will see the kind of methodology that is we usually follow. Now, if that is wherever you are studying these research methodology courses, you will usually see there is the area of the research, then you have an objective, then you have a hypothesis, you have research questions, you have area, research, sampling, all those that there is a given a procedure and which theoretical framework you are going to use, and then you go for the data. And once you get the data, then you do analysis and interpretation and then bring out the results. Now, this grounded theory is in a way different in itself, that it, of course, in a grounded theory, you should have a clear idea about what is it that you are going to research. Now, for example, what I was doing is I was researching about the tribal groups, that's Bakrwals in Jammu and Kashmir. I was trying to look about the lived experiences of Bakrwals, how Bakrwals are negotiating their day-to-day experiences in the current times through their interactions with the institutions of the state. That's I was mainly looking into the institutions of health. Then what was the influence of the modernity, how it's the changing nature of the state, how is it influencing. So this was my kind of research area. And in this research area, that is what my kind of idea was to do a research on. Now, I did not had any hypothesis, because when you use a grounded theory, you do not develop the hypothesis per se, because you are basically not going into the deductive logical framework. What grounded theory actually goes into is an inductive logic. So therefore, what we do is, when you have a research area, you enter into the research areas in the process of data collection. Now, data collection we usually see in the grounded theory is either based on the literature availability, the literature which is already available there. For example, the earlier studies which have been done there, whether they are qualitative, whether they are quantitative, those research studies, you consult them. That's the part of your grounded theory. You enter also into the field, you engage into the observation, you have the field notes, you have the diaries, you have the interview schedules. So once you engage into the process of the data collection, so this data collection can be both from the secondary sources, that's where we say the use of earlier research studies, or the texts that are already available in this domain, and also the part lies in your own interviewing, observations, where you develop fieldwork notes, fieldwork diaries. And once this research collection is done, once this data collection is done, then you kind of do what we call as analysis and interpretation. Now, what you do is basically we engage into three important, what we say as the steps of grounded theory. Now, we basically engage in codes, that is giving codes. Then we develop concepts, and then we engage into categories. And from those categories, that's where we develop into the theory. Now, when we come to the first step, that's about codes. Now, what is actually there? If, for example, what do we mean by this codes? Now in course is basically you try to see the prominent things that emerge are prominent kind of observations that come through your literature review, through the secondary studies that you are going through, or through the texts that you are involving in it. There is basically the generation of the course. That means the prominent uh, things, the prominent words that they have been using. And similar is done with the field notes, field diaries, in your interviews, and in your observations. Now, that means this is what we also call as open coding. Now, open coding is simply gathering data and searching for the patterns. Now, gathering data means your data can be in terms of, for example, as I said, secondary studies, it can be textual analysis, or it can be your field work, where you can be interviews, it can be your observations. And in this whole, you see, for example, which are the prominent kind of things that come out in this whole process. For example, the words, if you are researching, for example, on the terminally ill patients, for example, there will be pain is some word which is being kind of we see everywhere, used everywhere. Suffering, it's something which is commonly used. So you kind of use this kind of coding in the initial phase. Now, second thing what we do in the grounded theory is about grouping of the codes. Now, this grouping of codes is something where we try to see the similarities. Now, we see is there kind of relationship that exists between these codes that we have given in the very first step. Now we try to see what are the relationships. So we try to reduce these codes into certain classes, or we see what is the relation between them and then group them into the classes, or what we also call as concepts. For example, we will say pain, suffering. This is this will be grouped in one class or one concept. Now, once this kind of grouping of codes is done, which we also call as axial coding, we enter into the third step, that is what we call as selective coding. Now, selective coding is what we see also as developing the categories. Now, before developing the categories, that is once we have ended in grouping the codes, we develop the hypothesis here. Now, when hypothesis is developed here, that leads us to what we say as in the developing of the categories. That generates to us the developing of categories. Now, once hypothesis is developed, this testing the hypothesis is done in the form of the categories that we want to develop. And then the validation of this is done through the collection of the new data. And that is how we end from what we say from a initial step to the generalization or development of a certain theory. Now, this process seems quite very easy, that it does not include what we say as much into it. It seems quite something which does not take you a lot of effort, which can be done easily. But the important aspect in the grounded theory is, of course, this process of using or utilizing the grounded theory in your research is, of course, a very, very challenging process, because it involves how successful you have been able to develop the codes, and categorization of codes into classes and then into categories is completely dependent on how effective your data generation has been, how effective your data collection from the field has been. So the process of data collection from the field will determine how far your the process of giving codes and then grouping into categories and then generating what we call as a universal truth. Now, as I said, grounded theory was a challenge to that notion that qualitative research is not kind of very what we say as valid. It's not unbiased. Now, this process of giving codes, doing the similarities, then bringing the categories, all this process was actually to make that validation of this qualitative data meaningful. So in a way, in order to do that, we also use what we call as then the triangulation in this whole process. In this whole process of data collection, then coding, then to the categories, and then the development of the theory, we use what is called as a triangulation. Now, triangulation is something where we say is that the data that we have generated from the field or the data that we have used from the secondary literature, one is the coding is done, the grouping up classes is done, and the categories are developed. Then are these categories, the categories that are being developed, are these categories responding to what we were deemed what our objectives in the research were? Are these categories that we have developed, do they respond to what we were actually trying to look at? That is something going to the very notion of those objectives of our research is where we try to see how far we have been able to kind of do that, the validation. So forming conclusions is actually we are trying to do is we form conclusions in the grounded theory so as new research kind of begins. So new data collection begins from the conclusions that we have tried to draw from the earlier theories. Now, 3-4 things that are very, very important in the grounded theory that we need to take into understanding is that grounded theory is completely based on how successfully we are able to see the relationships between the data. Now, this if we are able to draw these relationships between the data, then only we will be effectively using the grounded theory. Now, relationship between the data is, that means you will be using grounded theory to research the new area only when you are very much clear what your framework of the research would be. Now, in order to explain this, let me give you an example. So most of the examples are from the health studies. So let me give you an example is, suppose we are studying the patients who are terminally ill. Let's say the patients, the cancer patients who are declared as terminally ill. Now, if we try to study the meaning that they attribute to themselves on being on a deathbed, this is something what, and the care that they receive in this process. Now, that is basically our objective. That is basically our research that we are trying to look at. Now, before applying the grounded theory, that means we go collect the data, see the process, do all other research. It's very important that we have the nuanced understanding of what the disease, the cancer is, how cancer kind of affects the human beings, what sort of this disease is. Now, we also have to have an understanding of what are the consequences of it. Now, for example, when you speak to a terminally ill patient on the deathbed, suppose he or she, or they may tell you that I have been suffering from a pain from continuously 4 days. I am not able to kind of speak now. Whole my body is paining. This is the statement that a terminally ill patient is kind of narrating you. So this is the narrative that you are getting from a terminally ill patient. Now, this narrative, if we look to this narrative, of course, talks about the pain. It talks about being stuck to the bed. It talks about not being able to move. Now, these kind of the things, we say that pain, movement, they kind of draw a certain kind of relationship about the whole meaning that this person is attaching to this process of being a terminally ill patient. Now, how far we are able to link these interrelationships is something that will determine how effectively we are trying to use the grounded theory. Now, this is a one narrative. I kind of give you an example. So when you are doing a study, there may be many respondents, the sample may be large. So when you try to have such kind of narratives, various narratives, there may be n number of such words which may be coming up in the narratives and also in your own field observations. When you were with one terminally ill patient, then second, then third, your observation also varied with respect to different respondents. And this observation is different from with respect to each of these respondents. And then drawing the relationship of this observation towards each respondent is something that completely lies on how we, as a researcher, we are trying to utilize it. And that is where we see that grounded theory makes an impact of how every researcher uses it. Now, we have interesting examples where many scholars, sociologists who have been using grounded theory, there have been different kind of studies which have come into fore on the basis of this grounded theory with interesting results. For example, we have studies on the homeless people, studies on the widows, which are based on the grounded theory, and very interesting results have come out from those utilization of use of this kind of grounded theory. But it was dependent on who was the person who was researching, because not everyone is able to use grounded theory so effectively. And that is where we find that to use the grounded theory in a research demands also a certain kind of an expertise over the domain of the area of research that we are trying to do. So we cannot kind of say that I will be, if I am doing a research on the health studies, that means I have a certain kind of expertise, my own training in the health studies, then effectively I will be using the grounded theory. That is irrespective of when we say about the qualitative, this quantitative research, because quantitative researches has a much wider application, whereas grounded theory in qualitative research also demands the nuanced understanding a researcher has. Now, that is why we say that grounded theory is about it's not about that you create a certain kind of a new theory. It's only about you develop a new, what we say as you discover a new theory, because you actually discover the relationship patterns. Now, this relationship patterns which was not known earlier, and when we were able to discover these relationship patterns, that is what is constituted as a theory, and our own understanding of this whole phenomena then depends only on this relationship pattern. And that's why we say that this grounded theory as an methodology or as a method is not kind of something which is generalized, and which can be my own grounded theory approach will be completely different from your own grounded theory approach. But how we are going to do the coding, how we are going to develop the concepts, how we are going to develop the categories is something which we all of us have to use, and that is where there lies the similarity. Now this similarity is which kind of pushed this approach as a possible counter narrative to the idea that research in social sciences is not valid, is not unbiased. Now, one important thing which you see in this grounded theory is that it has shifted, it has also evolved, changed over a period of time. Now, what we were saying currently, for example, open coding, axial coding, selective coding, these kind of steps is what we call as traditional grounded theory, the one which was used by Glasser and Strauss while working with the terminally ill patients. But this has now completely shifted. Now you will see nowadays ethnographical approach, which has also evolved as a part of the grounded theory approach, is being more often and extensively used in the field-based studies. And ethnography is something which is also kind of linked or heavily derived from the grounded theory. Now you see in ethnography, what they do is that the researchers spend a lot of time being with the participants, with the respondents whom they are researching. For example, you have some interesting ethnographies that have come over a period of time in anthropology, sociology, or social work. Suppose we have Sarah Pinto's work on the psychiatric patients in the Agra mental asylum. We have Aparna Rao's work on the Bakrwals in Jammu and Kashmir. If you read these kind of the works, you will completely see how they have used this grounded theory approach. So they enter into the field, they only had an idea that they want to understand the experiences, the lived experiences of, for example, the Bakrwals. Now Aparna Rao enters into it, uses interviews, uses observations, spends a lot of time being with the participants, and then kind of creates the certain hypothesis, and then again researches, and then draws the inferences and meanings based on that. This is and produces a very wonderful work. There is a very prominent book that's Autonomy, which basically talks about the idea of self among the Bakrwals, and you will see that work has become very, very, very influential. Now this is the change that we have seen in the approach of grounded theory from 1965 and now onwards. Now, grounded theory, its use, you will find, has been very often to see in terms of behavioral studies, which we are trying to understand. Now, for example, if I will say, as social scientists or as social science researchers, if you try to see why people how does people's behavior gets influenced by certain incentives that government tries to use in their policy. Like, for example, if we take Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. Now, with Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, we say this was again a policy of the government of India to kind of keep the surroundings clean, your own places, your own residences, your own workplaces clean. Now, has this really been responded by the people, or how have people who have responded it, how have they able to do it, what sort of a change in behavior it has been brought, is something where we could see the use of grounded theory approach. Now, similarly, in terms of if we see the behavior of people, if we see, for example, the voting pattern of the people, or if we want to see about the behavior of the people towards let's say any government programs. Now that is where we could try to see what different kind of interactions, interplays, relationships it has developed. Now only the what we see as the major kind of disadvantage with the grounded theory is that uh, larger studies which involve huge data sets are the biggest drawback of the grounded theories, where we have to kind of for example sample surveys, census, all those kind of surveys, nfhs, where there is huge utilization of the sample data. It is very difficult, or it's almost impossible to use the grounded theory. And that's why grounded theory now we are mostly trying to use in the understanding the behavioral aspects. And understanding behavioral aspects is done at a very smaller level. For example, we have to see successful case studies. Now if somebody's business, if you want to see the business entrepreneurship, we want to see the success of suppose person A as a business entrepreneur. Suppose a young student who has passed out from NIT Srinagar, in 4 or 5 years he has turned out to be a successful business entrepreneur. Now this is something where we could use the grounded theory, and where it can be a wonderful result can be brought out, and that is where theory out of this could be generated or discovered, that what was the relationship, what are the different things that were involved with. So that is where the grounded theory has been found quite effective. And in current times across many universities in the world, to understand the behavioral pattern, to understand the success stories of the organizations, of an individuals, or even of the communities, the grounded theory approach have been quite influential. Or what we say in current time is the ethnography has been found highly effective. And that's why we now see ethnography of the businesses, or anthropology of the business, anthropology of many other things have come out, which is basically based on the field studies. So I will just stop here, and we will have some questions and some discussion as to on the preliminary understanding of the grounded theory. I know it's quite a very what I say. I just wanted to give a very brief background of how grounded theory and ethnography is currently being utilized in social science, and how it's taking a shape in social science research. Just for your to develop a curiosity, maybe you might in your own domains try to look to it furthermore, and develop your own research on the basis of these understandings in the social sciences. And also I must also admit before you that I am also in the process of developing my own research, which is on the Bakarwals, and I hope there are 2-3 papers which are already there, and I will share them with the Nasir, and which you could go through. And there are various experts on the grounded theory, much more, who have written extensively on it, which could be quite beneficial for all of us and for you if you are at all looking towards your research in this area. And thank you so much. Looking for some interaction, some suggestions and questions and queries.
Thank you, Dr. Iqbal, for this wonderful session, and I hope this is really going to be beneficial for the scholars who are looking for research methodologies in terms of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach. And I hope we have, I hope there are some scholars or participants who might have any questions. Dear scholars and participants, please write your questions or raise your hands so that Dr. Iqbal may answer your queries. There were certain questions in the that were pertaining to the field of sociology and ethnic studies. If you please write those questions or raise your hands to ask the questions, and I hope Dr. Iqbal will be very comfortable answering all these questions on in the field of sociology and social work. Any questions?
Now, see, it's not necessarily that I may be knowing them, but it would be good if you raise the questions, because that would also push me to kind of
think about the possible answers.
Yeah, so don't worry about that. So
Okay.
that could also push me to kind of look to more and also
any
kind of
questions,
for my own understanding later on, which I would be keeping in the mind. So your suggestions, comments, that would be really appreciable.
Okay, there was a question. What would be the theoretical and conceptual framework about the topic women and PRIs?
Okay.
A sociological study, also the methodology. This is the quote unquote what the
Okay.
participant has written here.
Okay. So see, as far as we know, women and Panchayati Raj institutions, see, we can be looking to this area of research from many kind of perspectives. Like one perspective would be, for example, empowerment and emancipation perspective. That is woman and PRI, how this 73rd or 74th amendment, which has brought a major shift in the involvement of women in the local self-governance. Now, this 73rd amendment and 74th amendment has made possible that in local self-governance, the women have to be the active partners by reserving the seats for the woman. So we can look at from the perspective of empowerment and emancipation also. So we rarely see that once this framework of emancipation and empowerment is taken into consideration, then we can develop whether this PRI's 73rd Amendment and 74th Amendment has really brought in the empowerment and emancipation within the women who have been partners in the PRI process or not. Now, let me give you an example. Now, in Panchayati Raj institutions, it's compulsory that we have 33% of women in the local self-governance. That means at the level of chairpersons, there has to be the woman also reserved seats, and at level of Panch, there has to be reserved reservation for the woman. But we have very often seen, and our own engagement in the field has shown, that even if woman has been elected as a PRI, has been elected as a representative, is a chairperson in the panchayat, still the decision-making process is mostly done or operated by the husband of the woman or by the other male relative of the woman. Now, this is where it brings us to the domain that how far it has brought to the idea of empowerment, and if it has led to the empowerment, has it also led to the emancipation? Emancipation means, has it led to the change in the role of the woman, understanding, questioning the patriarchy, bringing women out into the public sphere from the private sphere? So these kind of frameworks, or this kind of approach we can use, this theoretical framework we can use with the question of women and PRIs. And there have been extensively, of course, studies with respect to women and the PRIs that have used this kind of a framework. Now, what framework you want to use also depends on what is it that you want to actually capture, you want to look into your area of research. Now, autonomy, decision making could be possible indicators when we look to the question of woman and PRI. Now, woman as a selected representative, is she now the decision maker? She's an elected representative, but is she taking the decision? Does this has influenced her autonomy? Means, does she take decision not only as a PRI member? Has her decision making in her own house being increased, decreased, or changed because of the PRI? There have been examples where we have seen the woman's influence coming from private sphere. Private sphere means the home sphere into the public sphere. It has also enhanced her decision making, but it has also made her more vulnerable in certain ways, because coming out from public to private sphere means you are challenging certain social structures or certain social norms, and that is where the woman has also been vulnerable. Now, this is also another kind of domain that we can look into the question of woman and PRI. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Iqbal. We are having another question. Can the division of Oedipus myth by Claude Lévi-Strauss in his essay be termed as grounded theory? So this is a very typical or Can the division of Oedipus myth by Claude Lévi-Strauss in his essay be termed as grounded study or grounded theory?
I think I have to look to it because I have to first look to this question, to this myself, and then only I'll be kind of making an analysis of it.
It's a kind
I
of
will take this and we'll have to kind of see to it, and then only I can make an kind of comment on
this
it.
question is a kind of headlong collision between literature and sociology.
Right. I have to first look to it in myself and then only. Yes.
Okay. Since keeping in view the time frame we are allowed here, I would like to invite Ms. Sabha Sangeem. She's a scholar of English from the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Management, NIT Srinagar, to please express her vote of thanks on behalf of the department and the institute to our guest speakers and participants. Thank you. Please, Sabha, you may go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. On the behalf of the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Management, and the organizing committee of this workshop, we would like to express our gratitude to Professor Abdul Liman, head of the department, for his support and encouragement in organizing such events. Our special thanks go to our esteemed speakers for today, Professor Roshan Lal Sharma and Dr. But Iqbal Majid, for their valuable insight in this topic. A sincere gratitude goes to the faculty of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences and Management, coordinators, and my fellow research scholars for their tireless efforts to ensure the success of this workshop. And special thanks goes to Hadi, Basir, Koshin, and Burhan for the technical expertise and coordination in live streaming the event on YouTube. Last but not the least, we are thankful to all the participants for showing interest in this workshop. Over the course of the next few days, you will gain more insight from the distinguished panel of experts who will speak on the aspects of research methodology in literary studies and humanities. I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sabha. Thanks, Nasir. And thanks, everyone, for being patient listeners. Thank you so much. Have a good day ahead.
Dr. Nasir sir. Nasir sir.
Once again, I express my sincere gratitude to all the participants, speakers, my colleagues, scholars, and technical team. And we shall be looking forward to seeing you in the next session. And we are going to have very, very informative and great sessions ahead. And since we are going to have very good and experienced professors from across the country. Thank you all once again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir,
Nasir
Nasir,
yes.
sir.
Yes.
Please, can you share the contact number of Roshan Lal sir, the Professor Roshan Lal sir?
Okay, you can contact me personally. I will send it on your WhatsApp or your inbox, right?
Okay, I will share my contact number, sir.
Okay, you just call me or text me. This is my number. I'm writing here.
Okay.
This is my number. You can text me, and I will text you back whatever information you want to have on this.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Words. Thank
Okay,
you.
sir.
Thank you all.
Okay, thanks, sir.